Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University School of Vocational Education and Training, SOVET. Master of Science, Information Security, MSCIS. Semester 2, MSEI 026, B, C, P, Doctor Planning Audit. Block-1 Risk Analysis. Unit 4 Risk Mitigation. 4.0 Introduction. The ultimate purpose of risk identification and analysis is to prepare for risk. Mitigation. Mitigation includes reduction of the likelihood that a risk event will occur and/or reduction of the effect of a risk event if it does occur. This chapter discusses the importance of risk mitigation planning and describes approaches to reducing or mitigating project risks. The purpose of this risk mitigation plan is to outline the risks that have been identified by the team as having highest probability to impact our schedule. These risks have been categorized as high, medium, and low. Any risks that will affect the testing process must be listed along with the mitigation. By documenting the risks in this document, we can anticipate the occurrence of it well ahead of time, and then we can proactively prevent it from occurring. Sample ISKs are dependency of completion of coding, which is done by subcontractors. Capability of testing tools etc. 4.1 Objectives. After studying this unit, you should be able to define risk mitigation, list the types of risk mitigation, implement strategies for risk mitigation, and monitor risks. 4.2 Risk mitigation. Risk mitigation is nothing but ensuring the smooth functioning of day-to-day business and making it sure that the process is completed by sticking to quality and compliance. This naturally eliminates much of the system error and human mistakes. If at all a mistake is committed, it has to be rectified before it could hurt the business. Ideally, there is an individual or group of individuals who have vast experience of the process and are well aware about the human mistakes, system error, and manipulations that could hurt the process. They are also capable of identifying mistakes, error, and possible manipulations. Further risk mitigation involves identifying the gray areas and eliminating them out of the process. This ensures that the same error don't happen in the future. Project manager is responsible for preparing risk mitigation strategy. However, might would like to take inputs from the project team leads, members, bus, QA, SQA, and IT infrastructure support teams to come up with an effective mitigation plan. Mitigation has to do with devising one or more approaches to control, avoid, minimize, or otherwise mitigate the risk. Mitigation approaches may reduce the probability or the impact. It is more of a proactive initiative even before the risk becomes a problem. The objective of a mitigation should be to ensure a risk identified doesn't occur or the least reduce its probability of occurrence. Contingency plan, on the other hand, has to do with what if you are hit by the problem for the risks you could not mitigate. This is in contrast the reactive mode. Reduction of risk to an acceptable level. Risk mitigation involves all steps and tasks which PM will take to reduce risk to an acceptable level or to minimum possible. Risk mitigation is all about forecasting the possible problems that might arise in future and finding out ways to prevent it from occurring or do alternate ways to avoid the problems from happening. Business continuity plan. Disaster recovery is also a part of risk mitigation. Let's say Al-Qaeda has planned to blast your development center. All our clients would lose all their money. This business continuity and disaster recovery is a step towards taking backup of all the data in a different development center, so that even if your office is gone, the clients don't lose out anything. Any risks that will affect the testing process must be listed along with the mitigation. By documenting the risks in this document, we can anticipate the occurrence of it well ahead of time, and then we can proactively prevent it from occurring. Sample risks are dependency of completion of coding, which is done by subcontractors. Capability of testing tools etc. In simple definition, mitigation should provide a result or solution to the existing problem, risks. E.g., suppose government plans to have new norms to banks, say Basel 11 norms, which will analyze the risk taking care during bank loans. Hence, banks should think of risk management, risk measurement, and risk mitigation. Mitigation should provide a solution for possible credit risks, market risk at each time bank identifies a risk. T. 4.3 Types of mitigation, risk. Risk mitigation, in context of a project, can be defined as a measure or set of measures taken by a project manager to reduce or eliminate the risks associated with a project. Risks can be of various types such as technical risks, monetary risks and scheduling-based risks. The project manager takes complete authority of reducing the probability of occurrence of risks while executing a project. 4.3.1 Mitigation Technical risks. When delegating tasks to individuals, their technical competency might be overlooked. If so, then the chances of the project getting delayed and not meeting the deadline will increase. Such delays can be avoided by increasing the communication frequency between the team members and monitoring their work. Another alternative is to divide a complex task between team members and then delegate each part to a single individual. By reducing a complex technical task into larger simple tasks, the execution time may increase but the chances of missing the deadline for task completion can be kept up as the risk involved in the task is being diversified by the project manager among multiple individuals. 4.3.2 Mitigating monetary risks. A project manager is exposed to various challenges and has to make critical decisions in seeing through the project's execution with minimal risk. Cost-based risk factors are difficult to estimate, and intuition in making decisions which may increase the costs of deploying a task should be avoided. A safer bet used by the project managers is to use sophisticated cost estimation techniques. Some of the techniques such as critical path method, CPM, program evaluation and review technique, PERT, are used to oversee deployment of a task or set of tasks and analyzing the risks involved. Advanced techniques such as expected monetary value, EMV, provide an insight on financial gain or loss if an event does or does not occur. 4.3.3 Mitigating scheduling risks. Executing the right task at the right time would help in lowering the risk of not meeting the project due date. Tasks can be assigned to individuals in two ways. The first one is to calculate the estimated processing time of each of the tasks and executing the tasks based on the shortest processing time, SPT. The second one is to define due dates for each of the tasks and process them based on the earliest due date, ED. A project manager is the best judge here as to which method he would like to use in scheduling the tasks and delegating them to the individuals associated with the execution of the project. An advanced method of decreasing the risks while scheduling of the work-based tasks is by using the Monte Carlo simulation method. 4.3.4 Best practices. A project manager can mitigate risks by classifying risks based on the priority of being a threat to the project's success. The risks can be classified as being high, medium and low. Once classified, the concerned project manager will be able to devote time based on the classification and eliminate the risks in a sequential or in a random manner. 4.4 Risk mitigation, risk reduction. If your assessment shows that you have unacceptably high levels of risks to your business, then you need to take some action to counter them. You could reduce the probability of the risk affecting your business. Limit the impact of the risk if it does occur. In practice, you will often wish to do both. However, generally you should try to reduce the probability of the risk affecting your business in the first place. One way of doing this is risk avoidance, i.e., avoiding doing the things that could lead to a problem occurring, such as not entering into a line of business, a particular deal or a new IT project, because it carries a risk. However, this might mean that you end up not doing anything new and hence not being able to benefit fully from business opportunities. You could instead take a more positive approach by changing the way in which you carry out an activity. This is quite appropriate to IT-related risk and usually involves adopting a best practice approach to acquiring or operating IT systems. 4.5 Risk mitigation, impact reduction. There are inevitably some risks to your business that you can neither eliminate nor reduce to an acceptable level. For these, you can only mitigate those risks by assessing what might happen as a result of the problem and reducing their impact should they occur. In many situations, the greatest damage can occur because no one fully understands the nature of the problem and end up making it worse. This can be avoided by common sense procedures, which should be part of your Risk mitigation approach. Do not take any actions that could exacerbate the problem. For example, if there is a problem with accessing files from a backup tape using a tape drive, you should investigate whether the problem is caused by the drive, rather than just assuming there is a problem with the tape and then potentially damaging other tapes by placing them in a faulty drive. Implement document procedures for dealing with likely threats and train your staff in their use. For example, there are many ways that a virus can get into your system, so you should have plans for quarantining affected parts of the system so that the problem doesn't spread. An important part of impact reduction is the early detection of problems. Where you have a risk that you can't eliminate, you should ensure that you have a fail-safe method of detecting the problem if it occurs. Often failures are very obvious. However, occasionally, particularly in continuous or recurring processes, a failure may occur silently and its impact will grow over time. If you identify this type of risk, you should build in a periodic check to detect the problem as soon as possible. Don't forget that to reduce the cost impact of a problem should it occur, you could take out insurance. This is a form of risk transfer and is a normal part of doing business. Sometimes you can write risk transfer clauses into the contracts for a deal such as a project. IT risk is, however, difficult or very costly to transfer effectively. See our guide on how to make the right IT choices. 4.5.1 Contingency Plan. A contingency plan is an impact reduction measure. It should describe in detail what you and your staff will do if a particular problem occurs. You may need a contingency plan when you identify a risk that you think has a high chance of happening and will have a high impact. You try to find ways of reducing the likelihood of the event, but you cannot reduce the risk to an acceptable level. The residual risk is still so large that you need to take a structured approach to reduce its likely impact. The main considerations that you should address in a contingency plan are: scope, what particular risk the contingency plan is designed for; initiation, how you will know when to put the plan into action; actions, what sequence of actions you will take in order to control the problem and minimize its impact; roles and responsibilities, who will do what and when. Good contingency plans are usually based on the shared experience of managers working together. An important form of contingency plan is a business continuity plan, BCP. This is typically created to cover the most serious of problems, such as the complete loss of all your servers and network infrastructure due to a fire. Such plans may involve planning for the rapid acquisition of temporary buildings, reciprocal arrangements with other organizations, special staffing arrangements, etc. See our guide on crisis management and business continuity planning. BCPs should be tested if possible. A test could be a simple paper exercise where different parts of the recovery procedure are run through by the people involved. This is adequate for simple plans. A full test of a BCP requires a full exercise. This will usually involve many people and significant cost because it will disrupt normal activities. Therefore, any exercise of this type should be carefully planned and budgeted. 4.5.2 Practical Actions for Business Managers. Risk management is relatively straightforward if you follow some basic principles. Below are some practical hints that you may find useful. Actively look for IT-related risks that could impact upon your business. If possible, use a small team to identify possible risks. A workshop environment will help you to think more imaginatively about risks than working alone. Assess IT-related risks using either a quantitative or qualitative approach. This will allow you to concentrate on those risks that are really important and not waste time on those that are not. How you actually measure the risk is less important than the activity itself, which aims to help you review risks rationally. J_4. Don't produce contingency plans for every risk you identify. This is a waste of time and effort. Concentrate on those problems that would have a serious impact and where you cannot reduce the probability of them happening to an AC-EP table level. You need a business continuity plan, BCP, to cover any serious IT-related risks that could jeopardize your business and which you cannot fully control. If you don't have a BCP, you should work on this first. See the page in this guide on contingency plans. Risk management is a continuous process. If you have not updated your register for a while, then there are likely to be new IT-related risks that you have not covered. Similarly, if you haven't looked at or tested your BCP for a while, it may have become out of date. Therefore, you may need to review these as soon as possible. Single quote dot. Even very small businesses need to review IT-related risks. The time taken need only be small, but it gives important assurance. 4.6 feet risk control. The collapse of Barings, Britain's oldest merchant bank, and the billion-dollar losses suffered by Sumitomo Corporation catapulted the need for sound risk control into corporate consciousness, but even before these spectacular losses, risk control had occupied the minds of those whose business it is to know, the regulators and the senior managers of the world's leading financial institutions. They knew that sound internal risk control is essential to the prudent operation of a financial institution and to promoting stability of the financial system as a whole. Risk control has a wider ambit than risk management. The latter is often defined as hedging or neutralizing the financial risks that result from one or a series of transactions. For the purposes of this discussion, risk control is the entire process of policies, procedures, and systems an institution needs to manage prudently all the risks resulting from its financial transactions and to ensure that they are within the bank's risk appetite. To avoid conflicts of interests, risk control should be separated from and sufficiently independent of the business units which execute the firm's financial transactions. The latter are often responsible for hedging the risks which result from their trades. In some organizations, risk control work is carried out by independent risk management units rather than specially named risk control sections, but the difference here is a question of semantics rather than job function. Numerous reports have come out in the last 4 years with recommendations on best practices in risk control and risk management. Two stand head and shoulders above the rest. They are the G30 report released in July 1993, entitled Derivatives, Practices and Principles, a Private Sector Initiative, and Risk Management Guidelines for Derivatives, written jointly by the Block-1 Committee on Banking Supervision and the International Organization of Securities Commissions, LOSCO, which came out a year later. These two reports together have shaped today's best practices in risk control. Both reports are rooted in simple common sense. They emphasize the importance of determining at the highest level the policy and scope of a firm's involvement in and the use of financial instruments, oversight by boards of directors and senior managers, a risk management process that involves continuous measuring, monitoring and controlling of all risks, especially market and credit, accurate and reliable management information with comprehensive limits, frequent management reporting, sound control and operational systems, and thorough audit and control procedures. They also stress the importance of the human factor in risk management. Professionals involved must have the necessary skills and experience, and the firm should not deal in any instrument until senior managers are fully satisfied that all relevant personnel understand and can manage the risks involved. The specific way an institution applies these recommendations depends on the complexity and nature of its financial holdings and activities. The G30 report caters for both dealers, financial institutions, and end users. Corporates. The guidelines are embodied in 20 recommendations which firms can use to set up and evaluate their risk management and control practices. The guidelines are divided into 5 main areas: general policies for senior management, valuation and market risk management, credit risk measurement and management, systems, operations and controls, recommendations for legislators, regulators and supervisors. The full text of the report is available from the G30. The Block-1 Committee (TOSCO) paper is directed towards banking organizations and supervisors to provide both a framework to follow and against which they can reassess their own risk management procedures. These guidelines are more detailed than those of the G30 and include sound risk management practices for each major risk identified: credit, market, liquidity, operations and legal. And while the G30 report called for independent credit and market risk management functions, The Busley Committee, IOSCO, goes one step further by suggesting that the entire process of measuring, monitoring and controlling risk consistent with the firm's established policies should be independent. This independence should be reflected in the senior hierarchy of the institution as well as the firm's exposure reporting system. The 1994 document has become the definitive word on best practices in risk control for derivatives, resulting from the Busley Committee's increasing focus on sound internal controls. Is Framework for the Evaluation of Internal Control Systems, 1998. This final report, released in October 1998, follows an earlier draft issued in January of the same year. The committee notes an analysis of the problems related to the losses incurred by several banking organizations indicates that they could probably have been avoided had the banks maintained effective internal control systems. Such systems would have prevented or enabled earlier detection of the problems that led to the losses, thereby limiting damage to the banking organization. The committee noted that the control breakdowns typically seen in recent problem bank situations could be grouped into 5 broad categories: lack of adequate management oversight and accountability and failure to develop a strong control culture within the bank, inadequate assessment of the risk of certain banking activities, whether on or off balance sheet, the absence or failure of key control activities, such as segregation of duties, approvals, verifications, reconciliations and reviews of operating performance, inadequate communication of information between levels of management within the bank, especially in the upward communication of problems, inadequate or ineffective audit programs and other monitoring services. It is thus not surprising that the 13 principles issued by the Busley Committee cover management oversight and the control culture, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, monitoring, and evaluation of internal control systems by supervisory authorities. Unlike previous guidance, the latest principles on internal control are not area-specific. Instead, the committee wants supervisors to use them when evaluating internal controls for all the on- and off-balance sheet activities of a bank. The guidelines stress the importance and role of senior management in establishing a robust internal control system. Principle 2 states that senior management must not only set out and monitor the adequacy and effectiveness of the internal control system, they should also develop processes that identify, measure, monitor, and control risks incurred by the bank, maintain an organizational structure that clearly assigns responsibility, authority, and reporting relationships, and ensure that these delegated responsibilities are effectively carried out. Principle 3 deals only with establishing a strong control culture, which reflects the importance the Busley Committee now places on the subject because it sees the former as an essential element of an effective system of internal control. The committee believes that it is the responsibility of the board of directors and senior management to push home the importance of internal controls through their actions and words. This includes the ethical values management displays in their business dealings, both inside and outside the organization. For example, senior management may weaken the control culture by promoting and rewarding managers who are successful in generating profits but fail to implement internal control policies or address problems identified by internal audit. Such actions send a message to others in the organization that internal control is considered secondary to other goals in the organizations and thus diminish the commitment to and quality of the control culture. The Joint Forum on Financial Conglomerates addresses the lack of management oversight in its consultative documents on how financial conglomerates should be supervised. One of the constituent reports, Fit and Proper Principles, 1999, sets out the criteria which supervisors can use to assess whether managers and directors are competent to fulfill their responsibilities. These include fitness, propriety, or other qualification tests being applied at the authorization stage and thereafter on the occurrence of specified events. These tests will not only apply to managers and directors but to shareholders whose holdings are above specified thresholds and or who exert a material influence on regulated entities within the financial conglomerate. The importance of these issues was again reiterated in a paper on corporate Governance by the Busley Committee. Enhancing Corporate Governance in Banking. Organizations, 1999, lists 6 key practices for banks and the committee hopes. The paper will help supervisory authorities worldwide to promote sound corporate governance principles. One proposed practice stands out because it reflects the growing concern among regulators over compensation programs in banks. Practice 6 states that the board of directors and senior management should ensure their compensation approaches are consistent with the bank's ethical values, objectives, strategy, and control environment. Failure to link incentive compensations to the business strategy can encourage managers to book business based upon volume and/or short-term profitability to the bank with little regard to short or long-term risk consequences. This can be seen particularly with traders and loan officers, but can also adversely affect the performance of other support staff. IOSCO has also published a paper which addresses risk controls from a supervisory perspective. Risk management and control guidance for securities firms and their supervisors, 1998, states that supervisors must make an effort to understand the control environment of each firm and ensure that these controls are adequate. They must therefore be proactive, rather than reactive, in devising high-quality control standards. Some suggestions IOSCO puts forward are capital tiering regulations, requiring the establishment of specified risk management and controls at securities firms and working with industry associations to promulgate the establishment of management controls. The IOSCO paper sets out 12 basic elements of a risk management and control system. Supervisors should use these elements as benchmarks to measure the adequacy of firms' control systems. The 12 elements are grouped under 5 categories: the control environment, nature and scope of controls, implementation, verification and reporting. Despite the BIS and IOSCO guidelines on risk control discussed above, recent developments in the financial markets show that there are still serious deficiencies in banks and securities houses' risk management practices. The granting of extensive credit facilities to long-term capital management, which allowed it to build up a market exposure of over $200 billion on a capital base of about $4 billion, and its subsequent near collapse prompted the Busley Committee to analyze the relationships between banks and highly leveraged institutions, HLIs. Banks' interactions with highly leveraged institutions, 1999, and sound practices for banks' interactions with highly leveraged institutions, 1999, highlight several deficiencies in some banks' risk control practices with respect to HLIs. Banks did not appear to possess effective policies and guidelines for managing exposures to HLIs in a manner consistent with their overall credit standards. Possibly because the activities of HLIs are so opaque and their trading strategies always changing. The committee also singled out strong competitive pressures as one reason why some banks compromised important elements of the risk management process to agree to generous credit conditions. Also, banks did not generally conduct stress tests on their exposures to HLIs, nor did they update frequently the information they received from HLIs. The committee recommends that before establishing a credit relationship with a HLI, a bank should ensure that all relevant information be disclosed on a timely and ongoing basis. This should include the HLI's liquidity profile, changes in the general direction of trading strategies, significant changes to leverage and profit and loss developments. The same report also suggests that banks improve the way they set credit limits for HLIs. These limits should recognize and reflect the risks associated with the near-term liquidation of derivatives positions if the counterparty defaults. The Busley Committee's thoughts are echoed in Report of the President's Working Group on Financial Markets on Hedge Funds, Leverage and the Lessons of Long-Term Capital Management, L 999. The main lesson to be learned from the LTCM episode is how to constrain excessive leverage, not just by hedge funds but all participants in the financial system. The report notes, our market-based economy relies primarily on market discipline to constrain leverage. In the case of LTCM, market discipline seems to have largely broken down. The breakdown in market discipline was made possible by risk management weaknesses at LTCM as well as at the large banks and securities firms that were LTCM counterparties. US banking. Regulators have notified banks that their examiners will be looking at the following points. Senior management and boards of directors must understand the strengths and weaknesses of their risk measurement systems, including model risk, liquidity risk, and the risk of breakdown of historical correlations among different instruments and markets. Senior management and boards of directors must have a realistic assessment of their tolerance for losses in adverse markets. The interconnection of material risks, including market, credit, and liquidity risks, needs to be integrated into credit and risk management decisions. The Busley Committee has also released guidelines specifically for interest rate risk management. Principles for the Management of Interest Rate Risk contains 11 principles which banking supervisory authorities must apply when assessing banks' management of interest rate risk. The specific manner in which a bank applies these elements depends upon the complexity and nature of its holdings and exposure to interest rate risk. The Busley Committee believes that interest rate risk should be monitored on a consolidated basis to include interest rate exposures in subsidiaries. At the same time, however, institutions should fully recognize any legal distinctions and possible obstacles to cash flow movements among affiliates and adjust their risk management process accordingly. While consolidation may provide a comprehensive measure of interest rate risk, it may also underestimate risk when positions in one affiliate are used to offset positions in another affiliate. This is because a conventional accounting consolidation may allow theoretical offsets between such positions from which a bank may not in practice be able to benefit because of legal or operational constraints. The 1997 report is more specific than the 1994 one and suggests ways of measuring interest rate risk, because prudent interest rate risk control is conditional on a robust measurement system. The committee believes that an interest rate risk measurement system must be able to assess the effects of rate changes on both the bank's accrual reported earnings and the economic value of the bank's assets, liabilities, and off-balance sheet positions. The Bank of England's report into the collapse of Barings brings to life the recommendations of both the G30 and BIS, IOSCO reports. Sections 10 and 11 of the Report of the Board of Banking Supervision Inquiry into the Circumstances of the Collapse of Barings, 1995, illustrate vividly the logic of every risk control practice promulgated by the above-mentioned reports. By doing so, the Barings report answers all doubts about the validity of risk control recommendations made by the Busley Committee, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, and the Futures and Industry Association, to name a few. The report also drives home the point that the essence of risk control is plain common sense and not technological and mathematical wizardry. It seems almost pedantic that the first two lessons for management singled out by the inquiry are: a. Management teams have the duty to understand fully the businesses they manage. B. Responsibility for each business activity has to be clearly established and communicated. 2. Principles that apply to all businesses, not just financial institutions. The G30 cites the failure of Barings and trading losses at Morgan Grenfell and Sumitomo Corporation as proof for the need of a new supervisory approach to global institutions. It believes that the largest proportion of serious financial problems at financial firms arise from problems which the organizations ought to be able to control themselves. It also thinks it is unreasonable to expect supervisors alone to keep global institutions from mishaps. Its report on International Systemic Risk, Global Institutions, National Supervision and Systemic Risk, L 997, thus argues that major financial institutions should take a leading role in developing a global framework for comprehensive and effective management controls, in cooperation with supervisors. Such a framework must take into account market volatility and the differences in institutional complexity and geography. Yet, the report acknowledges the greatest challenge to address is excessively risky behavior. Since no code of ethics is likely to eliminate that tendency, an institution's control system must at least aim to check the excesses of human nature by establishing an internal vigilance system that will provide early warning of such behavior. Controls must withstand both external shocks and internal breakdowns. An effective internal control system requires a major commitment to hire, support, and retain employees throughout the management system with appropriate training and background in trading, modeling, information technology, and other required skills. Invest in global risk monitoring systems, encompassing both sophisticated risk models and sufficient computer and communications capacity to handle high volume, high-speed transactions in all their financial and legal complexity. Establish a management structure with appropriate checks and balances between front and back office, for example, and with more direct responsibility to the respective audit committees. Adopt a more sophisticated approach to credit risk, operational risks, and management of collateral and related disciplines. This list drives home the point that comprehensive and effective controls are not solely a matter of skills and technologies, but of organizational culture as well. Framework for Voluntary Oversight, 1995, written by the Derivatives Policy Group, also contains a section on best practices for risk control. The group believes that the design and implementation of an effective system of control should reflect the circumstances of the firm. However, all risk control systems must have a high-level authorizing body that draws up the guidelines for the firm. These guidelines must address, among other things, I. The scope of authorized activity or any non-quantitative limitation on the scope of authorized activities. E. Quantitative guidelines for managing the firm's overall or constituent risk exposures. E. The significant structural elements of the firm's risk monitoring and risk management systems and processes. IV. The scope and frequency of reporting by management on risk exposures and the reviewing these guidelines. The members of this authorizing body should be selected by the firm's board of directors or its equivalent based on, among other things, the composition and expertise of the board, the customary allocation of equivalent responsibilities within senior management of the firm, and the nature, scope, and complexity of the firm's trading activities. Some risk control documents worth reading are more targeted. The main thrust of a 1995 report by the Technical Committee of IOSCO was to examine the implications for securities regulators of value-at-risk models, but the implications for securities regulators of the increased use of value-at-risk models by securities firms also contains a set of best practices for financial institutions to implement when using models. These best practices include recommendations on data integrity and reconciliation, the assumptions and parameters of the model and its operating environment, independent reviews of pricing algorithms, regular backtesting, and understanding how the model influences the firm's decision-making process. Motivated by concern over the large exposures generated in currency settlements, the Bank for International Settlements commissioned a report on how to reduce settlement risk. A report prepared by the Committee on Payment and Settlement Systems released in 1997 calls upon individual banks and industry groups to devise mechanisms for addressing settlement risk. Appendix 2 in the report, titled G. Settlement Risk in Foreign Exchange Transactions, contains a summary of best practices for controlling settlement risk. The 16 recommendations, drawn up by the New York Foreign Exchange Committee, range from basics such as understanding the settlement process and exposure to setting prudent settlement exposure limits, which must be adhered to. These exposures should be updated online and aggregated globally across all dealing centers. Banks are also encouraged to review correspondent bank relationships to ensure that the services they receive give them maximum control over their nostrum accounts. Reconciliation of all transactions should be completed as early as possible, and senior management should establish procedures to evaluate non-receipts of payments and to alert all concerned parties to potential problematic situations. Another report prepared by the same committee examined clearing arrangements for exchange-traded derivatives in GIO countries. Clearing arrangements for exchange-traded derivatives, 1997, discusses the sources and types of risks to clearing houses and the risk control techniques they can employ to safeguard themselves against such risks. The two main risks discussed are 1. Defaults by clearing members and 2. Failure of settlement banks. The most basic way of protecting against both risks is to deal only with creditworthy counterparties. This is easier said than done. Most clearing houses demand that their counterparties and members meet minimum financial requirements, including minimum capital requirements. But information on compliance with regulatory capital requirements is available only at discrete intervals. Given the considerable leverage and liquidity of derivatives, the risk profiles of clearing house members can change dramatically between reporting periods. Clearing houses are thus asked to conduct surveillance on members' positions on an ongoing basis. Other risk control safeguards include margin requirements that collateralize potential future credit exposures and either collateralize current credit exposures or limit the buildup of such exposures by periodically settling gains and losses. Procedures that authorize prompt resolution of a clearing member's default through closeout of its proprietary positions and transfer to a non-defaulting clearing member or closeout of its client's positions, and maintaining supplemental clearing house resources, capital, asset pools, credit lines, guarantees, or the authority to make assessments on non-defaulting members to cover losses that may exceed the value of the defaulting member's margin collateral and to provide liquidity during the time it takes to realize the value of that margin collateral. Some clearing houses mitigate their risks of settlement bank failures by structuring agreements that minimize the clearing house's potential losses and liquidity pressures if a failure occurs. Under such agreements, transfers between clearing members and the clearing house on the books of each settlement bank are affected simultaneously and are final. Also, transfers of funds between settlement banks are affected as soon as possible. Together, these steps can reduce substantially the amount and duration of a clearing house's exposures to any one settlement bank.
4.7 Risk Mitigation Plan. The Risk Mitigation Plan is also called a Risk Response Plan. The plan tells how specific risks will be dealt with and the action or steps that are required to carry them out. The Risk Mitigation Plan is often used in the project management software as a series of tasks in addition to those that were already on the original activity list. As risks are about to happen, the plan identifies what actions should occur and who is responsible for carrying out those actions. Risk management planning needs to be an ongoing effort that cannot stop after a qualitative risk assessment or a Monte Carlo simulation or the setting of contingency levels. Risk management includes front-end planning of how major risks will be mitigated and managed once identified. Therefore, risk mitigation strategies and specific action plans should be incorporated in the project execution plan or risk analyses are just so much wallpaper. Risk mitigation plans should characterize the root causes of risks that have been identified and quantified in earlier phases of the risk management process. Evaluate risk interactions and common causes. Identify alternative mitigation strategies, methods and tools for each major risk. Assess and prioritize mitigation alternatives. Select and commit the resources required for specific risk mitigation alternatives. Although risk mitigation plans may be developed in detail and executed by contractors, the owner's program and project management should develop standards for a consistent risk mitigation planning process. Owners should have independent, unbiased outside experts review the project's risk mitigation plans before final approval. This should be done prior to completing the project design or allocating funds for construction. Risk mitigation planning should continue beyond the end of the project by capturing data and lessons learned that can benefit future projects. Get a clear perception of risk mitigation strategies. Appreciate the use of said plan for monitoring risks in project management, since it serves as a checklist of all threats, perceived risks inherent in a particular undertaking, even before any damage or disaster takes place. Best practices require that the known and perceived risks be analyzed according to the degree and likelihood of the adverse results that are anticipated to take place. Thereafter, all such risks analyzed shall be documented according to their levels of priority in a form known as the Risk Mitigation Plan. After which, the development and integration of the corresponding risk mitigation strategies follows, and shall be referenced against the previously prepared risk management plan. Take note, however, not to confuse risk management plan with the risk mitigation plan. The former is the framework for the entire risk management aspect of the project, while the latter pertains to the entire risks and response actions plan. 4.7.2 What comprises a risk mitigation plan? A risk mitigation plan shall serve as the checklist of the anticipated risks, listed in accordance with the degree of their probability, as high, medium or low. Some project managers, however, deem it more appropriate to categorize the risks as most likely, likely or unlikely. The set of mitigation strategies shall likewise be listed in the plan, properly labeled as such and categorized under each risk. This document shall now serve as the project manager's checklist for project monitoring. 4.7.3 How is risk mitigation strategies implemented? Inasmuch as the main objective of risk mitigation strategies is to curtail the effects of possible threats or hazards, these strategies shall be taken into consideration during the project planning stage. While in the process of developing each phase, procedure or methodology, the project management team or the principal players of a transaction or venture shall also establish the critical points where the possible risks may take place. Each critical point identified shall have a set of mitigation strategies incorporated in its procedural guidelines. In actual practice, these procedures may be referred to as Code of Practices. In financial institutions, where numerous risks against lost assets, particularly cash, are perceived, these set of mitigation strategies are simply referred to as the internal control policies. In another aspect of risk management, a separate set of mitigating actions shall be incorporated to address the threats or hazards that were previously evaluated as having the highest levels of adverse impact in the event of its happening. The risk mitigation strategies are contained in a crisis management plan and shall form part of the initial emergency measures to take in order to contain and prevent the worsening of the damages caused by an accident or catastrophe. 4.7.4 How is risks monitored and mitigated in project management? As project plans get underway, effective project management becomes more critical and will require rigid monitoring of all executions by way of an efficient and constant communication with the team members. The project manager tracks the progress of assigned tasks and inquires from team members of any issues that may affect the successful completion of the project's objectives. Poor management can result to runaway executions that tend to lack cohesion, which can create more complexities and risks of not meeting the timelines and the budget. It could further result to intellectual drain for the entire team and depletion of financial resources. Hence, the importance of consistently checking the present status of the project against scope, limitations, methodologies, exclusions, mitigation plans and budget, to ensure that there is diligent compliance and that all risks anticipated are being mitigated at their critical stages. The project manager should also take note of new risks that may surface, for which immediate plans and additional risk mitigation strategies will be developed, documented and integrated. 4.8 Risk mitigation, monitoring and management. This section in detail describes risk mitigation, monitoring and management for each of the possible risks. It will talk about ways to avoid, monitor and to have ways to manage the risks. 4.8.1 Risk mitigation for risk. In this section, several different software development risks will be identified. A plan will be created to avoid these risks. We will think of the risks possible and of the way to keep the software development process from encountering these risks. It is important to have mitigation plan to avoid risks once and for all. Goal is to attack the risk even before it comes into existence. The plan will help in identifying the possible risks and to monitor them. 4.8.2 Product size. In this, risk concern is of under or overestimation, mainly underestimation, of the number of function points. If we estimate too few LOC, line of code, necessary for the project, we may get wrong cost figures which can prove fatal to the software development plan. To avoid this from happening, we will use conservative figures to reduce the probability of the risk. This means we will overestimate the LOCA little. If we end up finishing the project earlier, then that will not create any troubles. If the software cost estimations are passed with higher than actual cost required delivering the product, the software development team can get credited for finishing the product sooner. Also, for any reason the delivery dates get pushed back, development team can still deliver the product on the time. In normal circumstances, companies are not picky about the product size, so increasing the number will not cause any troubles in getting approval for the project. 4.8.3 Business impact. In this risk category, we are concerned about the quality of the final product. As mitigation step, we spend more time with the users to understand their needs. This way we can gather all the information necessary for the project to be successful. We try to understand business environment and can try to provide the user with help in defining software requirements. More the time team spends with the customer, better the understanding the team will have regarding the software. This will help in coming up with just right product at right price for the customer. Team has to make sure that the palm size PC integration and the cost of the palm size PC is justified, meaning that it really improves inspection process. 4.8.4 Customer, user, risks. If the users of the product fail to participate during the different phases of the software development, we fail to recognize problems with the software. To avoid this in the mitigation phase, we will try to meet the customer frequently and present software in phases so that customer and we can have better understanding the software being developed. More the time team spends with the customer, better the understanding the team will have regarding the software. This will help in coming up with just right product at right price for the customer. If customer fails to mention some special operations that have to perform with totally separate checklist and have to be stored separately, software development team does not know anything about it, thus leaving big problem in the software. 4.8.5 Process risks. We want quality of the product to be as high as possible. To achieve this, we will set up guidelines to be followed out for each of the team members during all the phases of the software development cycle. The standard will be set and defined for all of the software development. This will help the team in delivering the high quality product, thus increasing our reputation in the market. This will help bring in more clients in the future. It will also save customer from getting IO quality product. For example, palm size PC checklists are easy to get used to. If inspector cannot get used to the forms in the PC, they may go back to using pen and paper, which is not good for the reputation of the team. 4.8.6 Technology risks. To avoid risk of using technology that may become obsolete in few years after the product have been developed, we do excessive research on what technology to use for software development and will use the latest technology, programming languages, etc. To avoid this risk, software development team has to make sure that the equipment requested, i.e., palm size PC, are current and will not be obsolete in near future. 4.8.7 Development risks. If the necessary tools are not provided to all of the team members, their work will lack quantity and quality. As mitigation phase, we will make sure that the budget includes cost for latest technology and tools needed to achieve the desired product. For example, if the government refused to deliver the palm size PC to the DEQ, the PC integration part will be useless until the units are actually bought. 4.8.8 Employee risks, team members. This risk concerns the knowledge and of the employees and their willingness to help make the project succeed. As mitigation step of this risk, we will make sure that someone in ALF of the project development phases knows exactly what to do and the tools to use to achieve the goals. If the employees that have little knowledge in the main software implementation language fail to learn it, it may cause big problems when coding part begins. 4.9 Summary. This unit covers risk mitigation. Risk mitigation is all about forecasting the possible problems that might arise in future and finding out ways to prevent it from occurring, or do alternate ways to avoid the problems from happening. It also covers the list and explanation of the types of risk mitigation and also discussed different strategies for risk mitigation and to monitor the risks. Thank you.